Thursday Night Talk. This is a show where we discuss the week in Humboldt, the local issues and the local personalities with other local personalities. I'm Talvi Fried, your local host for the next hour. Tonight, our topic, farming and ranching in Humboldt County. What are the rewards and challenges faced by the folks who produce food locally? Do you shop local? Even if it costs a little bit more, do you look for locally produced products on your supermarket shelves? What does it take to produce food in Humboldt County in the 21st century? What does the future hold for Humboldt food producers and for those who do want to continue to shop locally, or in case of an emergency situation where we are forced to eat locally? Joining us tonight are Cody Nicholson Stratton from Foggy Bottoms Farms in Ferndale, Nick Bown-Crawford, Executive Director of Humboldt Made, and Lauren Sizemore, former executive director of the Buckeye Conservancy and livestock rancher and timber producer at Lone Star Ranch in the Neeland area. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello.
Well, I want to start off the show with a kind of clarifications and qualifications for everyone, because a lot of people don't know what any of these names mean. Even though we have a very educated listenership or a knowledgeable listenership, there are some people that are tuning in going, what is the Buckeye Conservancy? What is Humboldt Made? So let's start off with Lauren. Just what, I know it's not your sister who's the executive director currently, but what is the Buckeye Conservancy?
Yep, so correct. My sister-in-law actually is now the current executive director of the Buckeye. I was executive director of the Buckeye from about 2015 until 2018. And the Buckeye encompasses a lot of our local landowners, our local food producers. And the idea is to show good stewardship of the land and form relationships with maybe people who are not, who we would typically not associate, or well, I guess who our industry you would think would typically not associate with. Because, you know, what I really found when I was just being in agriculture and growing up in agriculture, and then also being the executive director of the Buckeye, is that a lot of environmental groups or people maybe that we would think of typically clashing with, we actually have a lot in common. The love of the land, love of our nature, love of our wildlife. And so forming that bridge and really opening that communication is really key to what the Buckeye has done and continues to do.
Awesome. So Nick, I'm very well aware of what Humboldt Made is, though I feel it's almost the opposite of, I mean, not the opposite, but it's kind of a downline group from, say, we've got a few people here who are the producers from the land, and then there's Humboldt Made, which is like the end product, sort of. So let everybody know what Humboldt Made actually is.
Yeah, so Humboldt Made is a nonprofit, so we're economic development driven, community benefit, and so we're really in support of the entire maker community in Humboldt County. And as of late, we've kind of expanded that to not just include like the end of the food system loop, so what you were referring to, like our niche manufacturing and our restaurants and stuff like that, but also expanding to provide supportive services for our farming community as well. Sovereign food systems is a huge passion of mine. I also do a lot of work in emergency food access and disaster management. And so we can't really have that accessible in the time of need if we don't have a robust and resilient food system. So I provide a lot of marketing, branding, direct-to-consumer services for a lot of our local agriculture. And, you know, we focus a lot on community engagement as a form of economic development. We throw a lot of very large events, and one of my partner organizations is North Coast Growers Association, who facilitates all the farmers markets in the county.
Which is a wonderful thing for both farmers and for people like me who can't grow anything. So I can go get fresh veggies and all that. And there's also all sorts of farms out here that now, which that's more of a Cody question, which is you kind of created a modern way of farming with really old school sustainable practices. And I know that you've done a lot of interviews about all of that. And there's a lot I want to get into. So it's, though, one thing I did want to touch upon was bringing old school farming into a modern world, because you've allowed, with your social media abilities, you've allowed people to see what farming is like on the day-to-day, and it's created a more accessible world. Also, you are one of several farms in the area that has kind of like farm boxes. And I kind of want you to just explain what that is, what caused you to be like, let's go on social media, let's do this, and then just the reaction you've got from people about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk about social media anytime. So our farm, our farm started in the 1860s. And so I am sixth generation here in Humboldt County, farming on the same land. And with that comes a lot of traditional, practices and history, because agriculture in a lot of ways has very, traditional things that ag communities do, that they practice, and that farmers tend to hold, kind of true to themselves as a culture in a way around their practices of farming. But we've seen a lot of that shift in the modern era as, we watch farms consolidate, smaller farms go out of business as, larger farms grow with size. And a lot of those family farms, end up selling out, are no longer in agriculture. And maybe it's a result of the economics of, farming is a difficult job. There's less than 2% of our population that is actively involved in agriculture now. And so maybe the next generation doesn't want to do the same things that they saw their family go through, not just those hard, that labor, but also the emotional drain that it might place on a family, the economic stresses that come with generally being a price taker, not a price setter. And you're kind of at the whim of the market. And so you see, those things, and then that couples with increasing regulatory burden. And so as farms look towards the future of what's coming their way, they have to answer the question of, can I really handle this regulation that I'm now, the reporting that comes with it, upgrades to the farm that might need to be made, not just the cost, but do I personally have the skill set or the ability to even meet those requirements? And so when we started looking at going on social media, I really wanted to give people this view into agriculture. What is it to truly, be on the land every day, and not just that idea, the idea we have of like the 60-year-old guy out there with a pitchfork feeding his cows, but someone that is at that point I was 20, so I'm a millennial. That's part of the LGBTQ community, so I was wanting to show representation of the queer community in agriculture, but also like all of the parts that make a farm happen. And for us, what we're really doing on the farm, and you kind of allude to that, is we have a lot of this traditional practices on our farm. There are things that we really value, and so old breeds of livestock that maybe aren't the most trendy or the current ones, practices that are generally seen by the rest of the industry as kind of outdated, but recognizing that we live in Humboldt County. Humboldt is isolated, and those sort of practices are what really fits our ecology and our environment here. And so what we try to do is always bridge that gap between using the best practices that are traditional and old school, and coupling them with more modern technologies that fit into that system that improve animal welfare improve production or efficiencies or health and safety, but always maintain the ecology of the land and really lead to a diverse ecosystem.
Before we get into sustainability and keeping the land fertile and emergency situations, which I really, really, really do want to get to, but I know our listeners are going to stay until then just to get to that part, because that's where you don't end up. Well, one, you don't end up in Humboldt, you come to Humboldt, and you do it because it's a certain specific type of lifestyle. Though there's almost this feeling, I'll get back to the emergency situations, which I'm going to geek out on, and get to the part where a lot of new people are coming in, or people are bringing families and their kids grow up and go, oh, I want to join the farming community, or they watch a, Foggy Bottom Boys TikTok and go, I'm going to go move out to the middle of nowhere and farm the land myself, but they don't have the resources to really fully understand. And one thing is, like, one person's failure can be, hundreds of people's, well, I'm not going to do that either. And so I'm wondering if everyone has ways that they're helping the next generation or a new generation, or even the same generation that just is like, forget city life. 4 generations ago, my families were farmers. I want to go back to that. But I lost all that knowledge. Like, what things do you have out there to help them actually keep the land healthy, not fail, not, use certain technologies that will destroy the land? We don't want another Dust Bowl.
Yeah, so actually I'll speak to like the economic side, or like someone who's really wanting to start. So I guess that would actually be a very appropriate question for where I currently am. So just to give listeners an idea, I'm actually currently in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, obviously. My husband and I are attending Ranching for Profit school currently. And I think, the biggest basis for that is to, we really need to treat our agriculture enterprises as businesses. And I think there are really great models out there for starting agriculture enterprises from scratch. But you just have to really be business savvy and really understand economics and business before just being like, I just want to go buy a few chickens or, cows or whatever. And then, a lot of these schools also, they focus on the environmental side of things, like taking care of the land, best practices. And I think there's actually a ton of resources out there for people who are really interested in best practices for ecological diversity, ecological health. There's a lot of resources out there for people who want to manage land.
Yeah, this is Cody. I'll hop in here. There are a lot of resources on the management side, the idea of like how we care for the land, things like the Soil Health Academy, where there's a lot of conferences that give you a couple of days of really intensive education. The Kivera Coalition has outreach and continuing education for farmers and aspiring farmers. Even within certain populations, we see like there's the Jewish Farmers Network that does outreach within the Jewish community. They help link Jewish farmers with education and practices, how to manage soil health. And then from our side, we recognized that there were a lot of people that really want to connect with the land, that want to, especially coming out of COVID, right? Like COVID, I think, was one of those things that if there's anything for me that I see that was good that came out of COVID, it was that so many people not only connected with the land, but they reconnected with food, and they reconnected with this idea that we need to know where our food comes from, and we need to be able to actually produce food. And the number of people that have reached out to us through social media, and we're like, we want to buy a ranch, we want to start raising sheep, and it always starts with that's, like, we support that. We love the idea of more people being in agriculture, of new people being in agriculture, because new people bring fresh ideas and fresh perspectives. But also is like, you need a plan. Like, what is your plan? Like, how, the ranch has to pay, the farm has to provide an income. Otherwise, you can't buy feed for the animals the next year. You can't feed yourselves. And so one thing that we've done is we offer like a shepherding school in the fall. So we give people that are interested in agriculture, that want to start raising sheep, a way to come spend 3 days with us. It usually coincides with our fall lambing. And so they can get a very hands-on education in how to raise sheep, how to produce sheep. What does it take to actually maintain a healthy, productive flock and to have a high degree of animal welfare? And it's giving, consumers, and some people decide, they leave and they say, you know what, this really isn't for me. I don't actually want to own sheep because I have to get up at 4:30 in the morning and go check on lambing ewes. And that's just not something I want to do in the middle of winter. Or some people leave and they're really passionate about it. And they started, there's one couple that started a grazing program. And so, it's a way to help people really grasp what it is to be in ag, because at the end of the day, or early in the morning, as farmers, you have to have that little voice that tells you to get up out of bed at some ungodly hour and go outside, because that's just what has to happen. And if you don't have that little voice telling you to get up and go check sheep at 3 a.m. or milk cows at 3 a.m. or check lambs at 4, like, it just doesn't work. And so you have to, have that oomph to get going. But I think there's a lot of people that have that, and they're finding that, and they're coming back to ag. And to me, that's just incredible.
Is anyone participating with 4-H in the community, or has participated? Because I feel like that's one of the obvious things to get kids into.
Yeah, so I was a 4-H kid. My husband was the former program coordinator, and he is a 4-H leader. I no longer lead 4-H, but I do volunteer with them and host classes, especially with wool sheep. And so that is a great way to get kids involved and have, youth find a path to agriculture and find a passion for it.
Yep, and then I did 4-H and FFA throughout my youth as well. And it's probably only a matter of time before I get re-involved with my own children. And I know Cody, it's like a ticking time bomb in his house before, he's both feet in the 4-H program, and really too.
Yeah, and I wasn't ever formally involved in those, but I grew up way out in the sticks in Elk River, and we grew up on a lot of lands, and we always had animals, and we raised our own livestock just for our family's consumption. And so I got that kind of hands-on, just kind of by nature of the household experience. And then obviously the work that I do these days and the friendships that I have, I end up spending a lot of time on farms, and it's an absolute blast, especially Cody's farm. So
if there were a nocturnal farm, I might be more interested, but I'm like, there's nothing that's within me that says you should get up at 4 a.m. and go milk a cow. And that's why I'm so grateful for farmers out there. We're going to take a break in a moment, though. After the break, I do want to get into the factor of food sustainability, land sustainability, as well as emergency situations. So we'll be right back. You're listening to Thursday Night Talks right here on KZZH. Welcome back. We're discussing farming and ranching in Humboldt County. We'll be taking your Zoom calls at 669-6833. Again, you can call 669-900-6833. At which point you'll be prompted to enter the following meeting ID number, 511-886-8501. Again, that's 511-886-8501. I'm joined by Cody Nicholson Stratton, Nick Bown-Crawford and Lauren Sizemore. Welcome back, everyone. Oh, and I'm your local host, Talvi Fried. This is KZDH on 96.7 FM. And you can also catch us on Access Humboldt's TV stations as well as YouTube. It'll play a couple times over the weekend, so at least once per day. So just keep your eyes peeled. Should probably get that down and be able to give it. Though we are discussing farming and ranching in Humboldt County, and it's important, one, because we all eat. Whether you're vegan, vegetarian, or omnivore or carnivore, for those who just want to eat nothing but steak, I don't blame them. Sounds good to me, but I know that's not healthy for me. We all have to eat, and we all need a safe place to live, though we also live in one of the most remote communities out there. I mean, people will send Engineers Without Borders to cities that are larger than ones in Humboldt County to give them water systems or teach them farming. But the fact of the matter is, we might need to be a completely closed off community or might end up being in case of an emergency service. And with the pandemic, it showed a lot of food scarcity because of rising prices, the inability of people to afford food. I think at one point, a dozen eggs was $9, which for somebody who has kids or is on even food stamps or something like that, I imagine that's just not feasible. One person might be able to stretch it out and barely, but like if you have other people under your wings, that's really difficult. And so there are a lot of programs out here. And I know, Nick, that you've been part of a few of them. You're the coordinator for emergency food, something.
Yeah, so I have a large background in just general disaster management and specifically in emergency food access. So that basically encompasses that when a community experiences a disaster or an emergency, their food access is generally cut off, or the ability to store and prepare food. And so probably the larger programs that I've instituted were in Atlanta, and those we were feeding almost 4 million households. But like in here most recently, to use the recent earthquake as an example, when the initial earthquake hit in Rio Del, it was labeled the Ferndale earthquake, but Rio Del really took the brunt of the hit on that one. Not only were we seeing like over 100 households that were completely red tagged, which means they're totally condemned and unsafe, but everyone didn't have water, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have gas. And so you can send in as much just boxes of canned foods and that stuff like that, but that's kind of like almost offensive to give to somebody who has no kitchen to prepare anything in. So you have to get really creative with emergency food access. And so we launched some really big prepared foods programs where we deployed prepared meals, hot meals, specifically down in the Eel River Valley to start with. And then when the storm cycles started getting really heavy and the entire county was inundated, and we saw power outages that were stressing, all the way up to Oric. Oric was out of power for over 2 weeks. We had to expand that program. And so when we built that program, it was we've only used local food preparers and chefs and food trucks, and we pay fair wages for each meal served. And so there's fundraising in the background. So we're driving money back into the economy with those services that we're providing for free to the communities in need. And then we also try and loop into that, having these local food producers pair up with local agriculture so that we're utilizing locally produced products. And Cody and Thomas with Foggy Bottom Boys, we contracted them twice, I think twice. Yeah.
Yep.
And, they were down there in Rio Del with me, and we set up shop in the fire hall kitchen, and they cooked burgers with their beef off of their land, which was, just shy of like 5 miles down the road. And so that's always the goal with these programs, is to like keep learning from experience on how we can best utilize our local food systems in time of disaster. There's lots of bigger pieces of infrastructure that go into play too. Food for People is almost done building out their new facility in Eureka, which will be highly impactful. They are our only food bank in the county, and they cover a wide area and a huge network with their mobile pantry systems. And the importance of their facility and what they're preparing for in terms of, emergency food planning is so much more important these days, especially with the, reduction in EBT benefits. Those all expired. And that was really an overnight just pulling the rug out from under, like, hundreds of thousands of families. And so really the only way that we can mitigate that as a community is joining forces with our local food producers and our local food banks and our farmers markets. NCGA has also launched a new program, which is the Food Hub facility. And so over on West End Road, and this new facility is one of the first of its kind in Humboldt County that will act as a distribution hub for local agriculture. And so farmers can send their harvests to the Food Hub, and then the Food Hub will distribute it out to the community for them. So we're making the right advances and the right steps. We still have some pretty big needs in terms of infrastructure. And there's groups of people that are actively working on that. And I've definitely gotten myself in the middle of all of this conversations, whether I like it or not. But yeah, so emergency food access, I think, is so succinctly tied with a sovereign food system. And we did have, we always talk in Humboldt about, when the big one hits, the bridges are going out, the highways are going out, and then we're going to be an island. So a lot of people didn't realize, but right after the earthquakes and when the first bomb cyclone hit, the earthquakes damaged a fair amount of our roads, and then the storms started taking out all the other roads. And we had about like a 22-hour period where we were island off. And so that just kind of shows to prove that this is really the time to focus on resiliency and understand that we are a rural community and we need to be self-dependent in a lot of these regards. And food is a big factor of that. With our traditional stores of food, so you're talking grocery stores and commercial warehousing of food locally. In Humboldt County, we typically only store about 2 weeks of food for the population, and that's not counting local agriculture. So now is also the time to switch that model over to relying on local agriculture to be those food stores. So there's a lot of work going on right now that's identifying food islands. So where all this food is being produced, what type of food is being produced, and what the capability is of all these farmers and ranchers to supply in time of need. And then we'll go out, we'll find the funding, we'll get MOUs signed with the farmers and ranchers. And so that when a disaster happens, there's no paperwork. It's just okay, this is the go time. And just the system kicks into gear. So that is the big picture goal that I'm working on currently.
How would the farms be able to sustain themselves if they were also islanded? Because don't they need to get outside resources, many of them at least at this point? Or is there this push towards each farm also being independent and sustainable on its own, like its own little island of a farm?
I think farms by nature are fairly built out for the most part to be these little self-sustaining kind of, ecosystem models, But I think this also speaks back to the importance of the type of farming that Cody is focusing on, which relies on far less inputs to the land. So they're not reliant on, trucking in mass amounts of irrigation and fertilizer and feed, because they're using rotational grazing, and the island on their property is sub-irrigated, which is where they grow their alfalfa. So I think a lot of these more climate and earth-friendly practices that are out there really kind of inherently make these operations much more protected and well developed to experience a disaster. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Cody, but.
Yeah,
I know.
I would just say, with those sorts of things, you're talking about inputs, they're both ecologically and economically intertwined, because, for example, putting fertilizer on your ground is not a preferred method for both the ecology and economically. It's really expensive, and it's not the best thing for your ground either. So by eliminating those sorts of costs and inputs, it's kind of a two-way win-win for both the farmer and the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we see there too is, we do both grass-fed beef and lamb as well as organic dairy, and dairy is fairly dependent on a fair amount of inputs, just in terms of things like the chemicals to wash our barn, because we have to be food safe. So there are things that we need, but as a dairy in Humboldt County, we also recognize that we're a dairy in Humboldt County. So we make sure that we maintain enough of those things that we need, that if we become isolated for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, we are able to sustain ourselves. And that's just something I find that's fairly unique within Humboldt County. Outside of farming, I'm the chair currently of the California Cattle Council. So I interface with a lot of both beef producers and dairy producers around the state. And I find that Humboldt County dairymen, aside from farming in maybe some more traditional old school ways, we also tend to approach things with the thought that at any point in time, we're going to be isolated, and we are not going to have access to things that, a dairy in Tulare milking, several thousand cows would totally take for granted. Like, if you think about the power shutoffs during the fires, for them, that's just like inconceivable. For us, the power being out for 3 days was just like a walk in the park, because that's normal. It was like, well, yeah, the power's out. We have backup systems for this. So I think part of that for farming is that we just have to build our farms and our systems knowing that this is Humboldt and we're going to become isolated. Like Lauren said, there are things that we cut out, like those chemical fertilizers. Not only are they expensive, they're not great for the land, and then you become dependent on them. That's really just a crutch for a management system that then becomes dependent on that. So you're not actually actively managing your soil, you're just kind of propping up that management. And I would say, as we kind of tying all this together, especially with like the food sovereignty, one of the things that came out of COVID, I think that we really noticed, and we know from nature, is that a diverse system is a resilient system. But when we look at like the beef industry, for example, and this trickles down through dairy, through crop agriculture, there's only a few companies that really control the majority of those systems. So when we're talking about beef, it's like 4 companies that process probably 90% or more of the beef cattle in the US. Well, when COVID hits and now they need to slow down these lines and they're not being able to process all these cattle because people are, they're having an outbreak in the plant, we're recognizing that small processors like Redwood Meat in Eureka that can serve our local community is probably a better system, right? Like, they're able to harvest cattle locally and keep cattle here, instead of all these animals going to large feed yards, being shipped all over the country, going through these major plants. So there's been this resurgence in the last 2 years of people building out smaller plants or processing facilities to harvest animal protein in their communities and to serve farms like us that are doing direct market. Unfortunately, the federal standards aren't really written to accommodate those. So you end up with a lot of struggles for those farms that are trying to set up their own butcher shops, trying to navigate these systems that are built for, global conglomerates, not for, Five Marys in Siskiyou County that's trying to harvest 10 cows a week through their own facility. But I think we're recognizing this transition and the importance of it, and we're starting to see that shift in agriculture.
You started going to where I wanted to touch upon next, which is environmental coatings and laws. And what difficulties do the national laws and California laws, like, are there difficulties? Are they actually helping Humboldt farms? What's the integration between communities that don't have, like, do we have more water rights because we get the water first in the state? I know very, very little about all of this. So whoever wants to go on a rant about it, because I saw a couple heads go, yeah, that's a thing. So,
well, okay, I'll put in my, because Cody can probably speak to this much more, but I'll just put in my really small blip about it. I had a really good friend who I worked with when I was the executive director of the Buckeye. I worked with a guy from Epic named Rob, and he said, you can't regulate morals. And, that's what the government has been trying to do. And I think in the process has really blundered in that way because regulations are extremely expensive. And it just really crushes small producers. And that's where then you see these like huge global, like Cody said, the meat processing facility that processes, would you say 90% of our beef in the country, because the regulatory burden is so heavy for small communities like us. Now, is there a really good solution? I don't know. How do you regulate morals, or how do you, ask people to do the right thing? I'm not sure of the answer of that, but anyways, that's my one small rant about it.
Yeah, and I would say that a lot of times the struggle really comes for producers and just the ability to handle that regulation. So if you're looking at being a direct market farm, like we do with our beef and lamb, or even our eggs, there are food codes that are written for those, but it's not just the federal standards. You also have state standards. Then counties will add their own standards on top of that. And depending on the municipality you may be operating in, the city itself may have requirements if you are selling USDA harvested beef. So now you've got all these layers that you're going to have to navigate through to be able to actually operate and to offer your community something that was produced in it. And so for a farm, that can be a really daunting thing because, I also need to move irrigation. I need to rotate cows. I need to do herd checks. I have, our dairy's organic. The amount of paperwork that goes into being an organic dairy is astronomical. There's at least an hour, if not two, of paperwork a day that I need to do just to keep track of everything that's happening on the farm. Thankfully, with apps, that's a lot easier because I can do it as I go. And so that can really add to the difficulty for a farm. And then if you start looking at certain regulations that are added onto it, I think a lot of times, they come down with the best of intentions, right? There's the idea is clean air, clean water, lower GHGs. And those are things I think that we all like. No one says, I want dirty air or bad water, right? Those are things that we all want. And a lot of times maybe those come into play because there's a offender in a certain part of the state, and that creates a regulation, but those regulations become one size fits all. So, if we look at things like reducing GHG emissions, California is on course to reduce its GHG emissions. It was mandated by SB 1383 for methane from dairies. But then the way those standards are written, I think it's a 40% reduction. But that also applies to a farm like ours. So now if we're looking at a dairy that's pasture-based, that doesn't have a lagoon, that doesn't confine cattle at any point during the year, like how does a farm like ours reduce those emissions. It's easy for someone in the Central Valley to say, like, I can throw a digester up on this, but how does the industry address farms in Humboldt that don't have the same kind of GHG outputs? And so a lot of times what we're seeing is farms, and that's just one example. There's water quality requirements. We do a lot of paperwork all year. And there's what we see though is a lot of times, Humboldt has lost nearly 50% of its dairies in the last 20 years. So it's a major decline in the dairies here. And some of that is economic. Some of it is just, there are farms that just looked at the regulations coming down the pipeline and said, I can't handle this. Oh, are we breaking for music?
Yeah, it's just about time. When we get back, you threw around a lot of terms that I don't know what any of them mean. Like, what's a digester in farm terms? But we'll get right back to that and talking about farming and ranching, as well as a sustainable future is what this turned into a little bit on Thursday Night Talks right here on KZZH. Welcome back to Thursday Night Talks. I am your local host, Talvi Fried. You're listening to 96.7 FM KZZH, here with Cody Nicholson Stratton, Nick Bown-Crawford, as well as Lauren Sizemore, and we are discussing farming and ranching and environmentalism somehow in Humboldt County, which is interesting to me that we're talking about all these factors of environmentalism and policy when it comes to farming, whereas usually I have I've had people on the show that go, oh, those multi-generational farmers just don't seem to care. They keep voting against what's best for, the world. So it's actually really great that I have, what I would consider a slightly diverse thing, because it sounds like everybody's on the same side. And I'm glad to hear so I asked before the break what policies that were happening to farming within the state and national level affected local farms. Because again, if you look at a farm like Harris Ranch versus Foggy Bottom Boys, farms, it's two different worlds. One has a ton of money, a ton of backing through, what do you call those people that sit there and whisper in politicians' ears? Those people. And so they have a lot going on in order to make it work for them. And they also I don't know if you've ever driven by those farms, but those don't look like happy cows to me. And so lobbyists, my producer says that the word I'm looking for is lobbyist, and that's correct, which I don't think that any individual here has a very specific lobbyist that they get to work for as an owner of their small farm. Or with their nonprofit, it's I know there are lobbyists for nonprofits, so it's interesting. Cody went into conversation about just what those laws have to do and how it is very difficult to comply with laws that were created for mass production. And I want you mentioned a few things, GHG emissions. I don't know what those are.
So greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, okay.
So we're just talking about, so like a farm like us would have a carbon farm plan. So where we actually track where our carbon is coming from and how we're reducing that. So, and then I think you mentioned before the break, digester was one of the others. And that's, yes. So those are methane digesters. So, a lot of dairies, there was, when they moved cattle onto dry lots, they set up flush systems because liquidizing manure and running it to a big lagoon and holding it there was a really easy way to handle it, and it kept it contained. But those also then create anaerobic environments for methane production. And so what they do is they enclose those and capture the methane. And so that has become, a major thing to reduce methane emissions. But as with everything, we find that there's downstream effects to that, right? So there are other like VOCs, there's other things that come as a result of that. So for a farm like ours, we're not producing that kind of manure that would make a digester even a consideration. So that's not something that we deal with, but it does create, you're then getting carbon credit. So it's a stream of revenue for a large dairy that now they're able to turn an income off of this manure, whereas, our cows are fertilizing the field. And so we're not, it's, for us, it's fertilizer, but we're not creating an actual cash incentive from it. So I think a lot of times what we see are these regulations have unintended consequences that penalize small farms. And those small farms generally then sell out and transition to something else or completely leave. But if you were looking at, say, dairy cattle, the dairy cattle don't go away. There's, so far this year, the national herd's grown by 36,000 cows, which is a lot of cows. Those cows just move to larger dairies. So they just continue to consolidate. And so and they consolidate in states that don't have the same regulation. And so then instead of it actually addressing the issue we're trying to address, it more or less becomes a not in my backyard situation, unfortunately, where now it's moved to Texas and then it's not really doing anything because GHGs affect all of us. So it's one of those things where I think, for me, I love programs that incentivize the good actors, that really incentivize farms. And I think that's one area where we see the intersection between farming and environmental groups working so well together, is that when they collaborate and we incentivize practices that are really beneficial to the environment and also, support good farming practices, we preserve open spaces, we provide clean air, clean water, we provide habitat. Like there's even in, if we look at the Central Valley, they have the tricolored blackbird. It's an endangered bird species. And with the Audubon, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and several other groups, they collaborated with farms to basically not harvest silage corn crops that birds were nesting in. And so they help offset that loss to the farm, but now you have breeding grounds being preserved for an endangered species. And the farm doesn't lose out economically on that, but you're also creating habitat for this bird species. And so there's really amazing ways. Audubon is one organization that they intersect and work with ranchers on so many levels to preserve bird habitat. It's incredible. And we don't think inherently, right? We don't think Audubon is working alongside ranchers to create, nesting songbird habitat, but they have amazing programs and they work with so many ranchers to do that it is one of those things for me that I see, and I think there's a lot of hope for the future of agriculture and for the environment when we recognize that these two sides are really not two separate sides. We're just kind of talking at each other, but when we get together and actually work on an issue, the outcomes can be incredible.
So when it comes to government subsidies, it was mentioned dairy farms quite a bit in this, but isn't there a huge national storage of cheese? And I don't think that's a myth. It's just there's this huge amount of cheese that's just sitting there that is not being used, and it's so confusing and baffling to me that there's I understand that having the cheese made locally, I'm going to tell you, is going to be 10,000 times better than that cheese there. It's just going to taste better. It's going to be probably more nutrient rich, who knows, but it's kind of strange to think that there could ever be a dairy shortage when there's literally an entire warehouse that will feed America 30 months over, it sounds like. I mean, I don't know the actual numbers here. That was perhaps hyperbole.
So I can tell you the interesting thing about the cheese situation, and Nick can probably speak to this as well. So from an economic standpoint, that is actually, that inventory is used. So there are whole people that their jobs are just dairy economics. And so that inventory actually helps back what our pricing is that we're paid, as well as how cheese is sold on the global market. It's a kind of a weird, we get hung up on the idea of it being like the storage, but that's actually also impacts the global market of cheese and how cheese is sold. And a lot of countries have these mass stores of cheese. Cheese happens to be a thing that can be stored. So what you think of it, milk has a really short shelf life for the most part. Sour cream has a short shelf life. A lot of the dairy products do. Cheese is just this one thing that gets sold, and it's generally they have it in categorized as blocks and barrels. And so that impacts like the pricing. A lot of times that is used in food programs. So that goes into the food programs that Nick would be working more with.
Yeah, I think, I think everybody is probably familiar, at least when I lived in the South. I was in Atlanta for 16 years, and, the adage of like government cheese, everybody's really familiar with it, because most people that are on like welfare programs in the southern states, that's where a lot of the warehousing occurs. And I think there's like 50 or 100 of these warehouses around the country, solely for these cheese products, and they're highly processed. It started in the it's very odd that I know the background on this asking, but it started like in the 50s. And so it really was like this, they developed this processed cheese and powdered cheese products. And that was a really like shelf stable thing that they could warehouse and distribute widely, and packed a punch with protein and nutrients. It was checking all the boxes. And then like, as you get kind of later on, and that just kept going on. And then I think it was in the 80s, then they started using that stock of government cheese to actually help offset commodity pricing. So they would reintroduce it just kind of like we do with like oil reserves in the US. To like ease the price of oil, they would start introducing the oil into markets. So they played around with doing that in the 80s and 90s with cheese into the dairy commodity market. So they would artificially like add more dairy into the market and try and drive the price down. So that's kind of the basic background behind government cheese, but it's definitely like, it's in these little, it's still packed in these little kind of jars. And it's like a cheese spread sauce, sort of. It's like a nacho cheese that's butter spreadable. I guess that's how you would describe it.
I don't know if it sounds good or terrible. I know I've eaten it. I remember as a kid I ate it, but I cannot remember what it tastes like. So I imagine I put it out of my mind.
That's where Cheese Whiz came from. So the idea of Cheese Whiz came from government cheese.
I mean, not that I wouldn't eat Cheese Whiz, but kind of gross. I don't know. Can we exchange some maple syrup for our cheese that, it's time for the round robin. Time flew here talking about all the fun farming stuff in Humboldt County. The round robin, everyone gets about 3 minutes, and you can talk about, 2 to 3 minutes. You can talk about whatever you want the listeners or viewers on the TV stations or YouTube to take home with them about farming, ranching, or whichever programs you're working on. You can just tell them your favorite part about the day. That's cool too. It's your time to talk. So let's start with Nick.
Sure. So I think, one of the biggest things that I work with all of the agricultural focused folks that I'm supporting and uplifting is that, the best way to engage the community with your products is to humanize the food that you're growing. So that comes in a lot of different forms. So with Cody, those stuff that he does on social media, this is him showing himself and this personality that people are connecting with literally on his land, handling his animals and producing their products. And so I think it's such an energizing thing. And if you're not a farmer, you can do this and partake just by going to a farmer's market. Walk around, have those conversations. You don't have to buy everything. Generally speaking, especially these days with grocery store prices the way they are, they're inflated because of the cost of distribution primarily. And so the prices that you're seeing at local farmers markets are highly competitive to what you're going to find in the grocery store. And you're going to see, 10 times the amount of like nutrient density if you're like solely shopping with these local small farms at your farmer's market. So I really encourage everybody to like, if you want to really like try and connect with your local food system, it's really easy and it doesn't take that much effort. It's just like heading down to the farmer's market closest to you. The Arcata Farmers Market probably has the highest density of local farmers. It's our largest one. It's also the longest running farmers market in US history. Little fact. So just go walk around, grab some coffee, and just talk to the farmers. You get to meet Cody's husband there. They have a booth, and you can buy some eggs. But I think that's my like challenge to the community at large, and my advice for anybody that is in farming and agriculture is focus on that like human connection, and that's what the consumer is really looking for right now.
And Nick, I'll just interrupt real quick to throw in that Cody's husband is really cute, so I highly recommend it.
That's truly what counts. Well, Lauren, your time has started.
Okay. So I guess, what I would say is in agriculture, and I see it especially in Humboldt County producers, is that we constantly continuing to be creative and innovative. And to be competitive, I think as a small food producer, you just continuously have to think of new ways on what you're doing, and just continuing to improve what you're doing. And then with that, I know when I'm out horseback riding my horse, I just feel so lucky that I get to live the lifestyle that I live. And I feel so lucky that I get to see all the incredible diversity in wildlife. One of our favorite conversations at the dinner table with my kids is, what did we see today on the ranch? What kind of wildlife was out there? What's happening this time of year? And I know that I am very privileged and that I'm in a very unique position, and I want to do the best that I can to take care of this landscape so that it's here for many more generations, and that it continues to stay healthy and sustainable. And those are the really big important things for us is ecologically, economically, how are we going to sustain our land, and keeping our family values also in mind.
Thank you, Lauren. Cody, you've got maybe 2.5 minutes here.
Okay, well, I think Nick and Lauren covered a lot of the things that I was gonna say, but I think for me that there's two things that I really think of. And the first is that I would love to challenge everyone to just get involved in food production in some way, and recognizing that everyone doesn't have access to land, but maybe you have access to a window planter and you can grow basil, you can grow maybe a tomato on your patio. Just making that connection to what it takes to produce food on some level. You don't have to be raising meat chickens or a steer. It can be, there's great value in producing lettuce. There's great value in growing spinach, or zucchini does incredibly well in Humboldt County. So, just understanding like what it takes to produce food on some degree, and the satisfaction that you get from producing it and from recognizing that. When we think about our population now, with less than 2% of it being farmers, and the detachment that we have from agriculture, a lot of people go to the grocery store and they buy food, but they don't think about what's behind the food. What did it take to get it there? Not just the farmer, but the processing of that food. And even though the processing is washing, lettuce, there's a degree of processing in everything, how it gets there. And so making that connection, I think, is important. And I think the other thing that for me, I see so much value in is the non-traditional collaborations and relationships, and finding ways to cross those divides and the gaps between producers, food producers, the environment, our local tribes, making sure that we have great collaborations that are respectful of our local tribal communities, that work with them, help them to provide food sovereignty for their communities, and bridging all those gaps. Unfortunately, the situation we're in, we got to because we didn't create those relationships. We didn't build those collaborations. And I think that we're not too far gone. We can reel it back in, and we can build those collaborative relationships to do better, not just to improve the environment, but to provide access to food, high density, high nutrient food to our local communities and to members of our community that are at risk or disadvantaged and aren't able to access that.
Great advice. That's about all the time we have today. Thank you to Cody Nicholson Stratton, from Foggy Bottoms Farms in Ferndale, Nick Bown-Crawford, Executive Director of Humboldt NAID, also emergency food expert, very impressive with all that knowledge given to us today. Lauren Sizemore, former Executive Director of the Buckeye Conservancy and livestock rancher and timber producer for Lone Star Ranch out in the Neeland area. Thank you. We'll be back next week with another Thursday Night Talk. If you have topics or suggestions for the show, email us at kzzh@accesshumboldt.net. And just a reminder, this show replays on Friday evenings at 8 p.m. right here on KZZH 96.7 FM. And you can watch this show on Access Humboldt's YouTube channel as well throughout the weekend on Channel 11. Thanks for joining us. And do those challenges.